in terms of Britain's imperial security, because Palestine was supposed to act as a bulwark to Egypt and the Suez Canal, the artery of the British Empire. But I think it's important that we acknowledge that there are only a few members of the government who thought that Zionism would be a useful way to go about doing that.
That there's no point in making enemies of the Arabs?
The point is that there was a profound consensus within the government about Jewish power and its importance for the war. We have to remember that in 1917, everything was at stake. It wasn't just a question of sitting back and carefully planning.
Decision-making in London, aren't you? And yes. Across the empire, you certainly had the classic British Arabists, and you had the servants of the crown working in India, who had a completely different perspective on what was likely to be the consequence of facilitating the creation of a Jewish home in Palestine. I mean, there were those who were servants of the empire in the subcontinent who were worried of the effect that it would have on Muslims in India.
And I'd like to suggest one additional motive, which is anti-French sentiment, because empires are great powers are much more concerned with the relations with one another than they are with minorities and
the subjects.
Yes, the subjects. So behind the Balfour Declaration, there is a colonial mindset which dismissed as of no significance the Arab majority, the Muslim majority in Palestine. But there is also a calculation which was directed against the French, because in 1916, Britain and France signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret agreement to carve up the Middle East into spheres of influence between them. And Palestine wasn't assigned either to Britain or to France. And Lloyd George thought that was a mistake, and he wanted to acquire Palestine for the British sphere of influence. And one way of doing this is forming the alliance with the Zionists, who would then claim Palestine, and then Britain would have an entree into Palestine through its Zionist ally.
How would you, in this context, judge or evaluate the language used in those very few words of the declaration?
The wording is fascinating, yes, which is why scholars have been discussing them ever since. The Balfour Declaration promised British support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, provided it didn't prejudice the civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Now, in 1917, the Jews were 10% of the population, and the Muslims were 90%. And it's absurd to offer a national home, national rights, to a minority of 10% and ignore the rights, the natural rights of the majority. But that's precisely what Balfour did in his declaration, and that's why it's such a classic colonial document.
Okay, but I don't think it's only colonial. I'm always fascinated by the capacity of the British to depict things in a way that kind of glosses over the kind of problems that the logic of the words, the document, would imply.
Such as?
Well, basically that this homeland, they didn't define what the size of it would be. They didn't define what the population spread would end up being. They didn't trouble themselves with whether it would be a kind of cultural home or it would be a sovereign state. In fact, I don't think most of the British establishment envisaged sovereign statehood for anybody in the empire at that time.
But empires do thrive on generalities, don't they? They don't care for nuance, on detail.
And ambiguities.
Because they're the one who can interpret it later.
Yes, to suit their own interests. Exactly. But the ambiguities that are not constructive ambiguities, they are destructive ambiguities for the subjects. Yes. And the wording of the Balfour Declaration came back to haunt the British in the interwar period. The dialogue between the Zionists and the British authorities went as follows. The Zionists said, "But you promised us a state." And the British replied, "No, we didn't promise you a state. we promised you a national home, which isn't the same. So the arguments continue about the meaning of the declaration.
But didn't Lord George
since.
come back in 1922 or so and say, yes, we were talking about a Jewish state?
Yes.
Well, so, I think that there's 2 points that need to be made here, though, about the terminology. The first is that when they were drafting the declaration, the focus was on its potential impact on world Jewry outside of Palestine. There was hardly any discussion in the cabinet at all as to what the future might be for Zionism. And a big part of that, the inability to truly understand the populations that were affected. On the one hand, the Palestinian population were not considered to be a national community. They were considered to be a hodgepodge. Right. They were thought by the British not to be a significant concern. And in addition to that, the British also completely, for the most part, completely misunderstood Zionism. They thought that mainstream Zionism was not a statist movement. They misunderstood Jews and Zionism and Arabs. They thought that they were backward. They thought Jews were more advanced than Arabs, but they thought that both communities were backward. And they assumed that because they were backward, they would never seriously consider that they would actually have proper independence.
Now, moving on, by the mid-30s with the Arab-Palestinian revolt, now we have a British white paper that speaks of perhaps 2 states on Palestine or in parts of Palestine. Does that mean that the British started by then regretting some of the stuff that they were making in the early part of the century?
I think in 1937, when you have the report of the Palestine Royal Commission that's sent to Palestine to figure out what's going wrong and what should be the future direction, I think it's hugely significant that this is the first time that the British start to think about what the end game might be. Now, the Commission plumps for the solution, the 2-state solution. Given that the declaration, the Balfour Declaration, was issued in 1917, and the British government only seriously considers where all of this is heading in the long term in 1937, begs a lot of questions.
In between whiles, the Balfour Declaration has been written into the League of Nations mandate. So under the terms of the mandate, the British are supposed to implement it, that carry through on the Balfour Declaration. One of the other things they're supposed to do and didn't do is to set up assemblies of the population in Mandate Palestine for them to participate in the running of their own affairs, and they neglected to do so.
So,
briefly, Avias.
The British wrote the Balfour Declaration into the terms of the League of Nations mandate over Palestine, and then it became a legal commitment. But the British realized in the interwar period that they had made a mistake. They were saddled with these incompatible promises, and they had to somehow manage the 2 conflicting communities that they had encouraged during the First World War. And there was no solution. There was 1 land and 2 people, and this was the conflict was about. The British philosopher Isaiah Berlin compared the British mandate over Palestine to a minor British public school, where there was the High Commissioner who was high-minded and fair-minded and wanted justice for everybody, but the assistant masters were much more sympathetic to the Arabs than they were to the Jewish boys, who had the irritating habit of writing letters to their influential relatives around the world, complaining about everything from the quality of food to the quality of the teaching.
Well, they may have been marginally more sympathetic to the Arabs, but they were arrogant towards both.
I think that the key thing here is it brings us back to the Balfour Declaration is the fact that the British did not define what a national home was. And there's a reason for that. The reason being is that, first of all, the Balfour Declaration was issued primarily for concerns outside of Palestine during the war, but also the British assumed that they could easily manage what they thought was mainstream Zionism, which was non-statist Zionism. They also thought they made another significant error in that they thought that the Palestinians were not a nation and would eventually accept Zionism, because they thought that the Zionists and the Jews were quasi-Europeans. not real Europeans, quasi-Europeans, almost white,
They became
but not
Europeans
quite.
when they went to Palestine, I guess.
More European, but never quite there.
Before we end, I just need to finish up with 1947, Avi. So here we have recently a new classified information or documents released, and I think here the Guardian in April 26 says that the British government knew from the moment it planned to withdraw its forces from Palestine more than 6 years ago, 1947, that partition of the territory and the founding of the State of Israel would lead to war and the defeat of the Arabs, as the secret documents revealed. So actually, their departure was as controversial as their arrival in Palestine.
Yes, and as dishonest as their arrival in Palestine, because during the twilight of the British mandate, they also played a double game. Officially, they disengaged. There was a UN partition plan to partition mandatory Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, and the British refused to implement this UN resolution, so they stood back. But they knew full well, as the documents reveal, that there would be a war and that the Arabs would lose and that the Jews will come out on top.
Yes, but we shouldn't leave the impression that they wanted that war.
Hold that thought, Rosemary. These were the days of empire. As it were, we will take a news break, and when we come back, we'll discuss more about both the British and the Israeli narratives on Palestine when we come back from a news break.
With Chaim Weizmann beside him, former British Prime Minister David Lloyd George reaffirmed his own Zionist credentials.